2020, we started a series called Dolly Decades, where we went through from the 60s, we planned to go up until the 2010s, where we shared some notable things about dolls, all kinds of dolls in that decade, some of our favorite dolls, some of the quality changes that you can see, some of our favorite play sets, and we're picking up with the 1980s.
Shelley's enthusiasm and bias toward this particular era might show.
So I was born in 1991, but because of like having an older sister and having parents that bought a lot of secondhand items and having predominantly like thrifted toys for the earlier years of my life, I feel very like nostalgic for the 80s, and Barbies from this era are my favorite, even if they were ones that like I didn't know about growing up. There's something about them that I'm crazy about, and I love me Cabbage Patch dolls from this era too. That's my favorite era of Cabbies.
Among the other many fine products made in the 80s, you have yours truly, circa 1987. My earliest memories growing up, like, I remember the early 90s, and I feel like fashion and like the style of Barbies they had that reflected the fashion were very similar in the late 80s when I was born, and like the early 90s when I remember. So I'm very nostalgic toward that, like the late 80s, early 90s.
And that's why Colleen brought Courtney.
You can see that even though this doll was made in the 2020s, she's a historical character who's based on the 1980s. And like what I happen to have her dress in for another project, this shirt looks like a lot like the Cool Tops Skipper Style Magic Barbie, and you see a lot of these polka dots like on leggings of Barbies from that time, so you can really see her style reflected. My favorite thing is that American Girl was actually made, the originals were made in the late 80s, and it started with Molly, Kirsten, and Sam.
And these are the originals. They have Flashy Sammy. She's the white body.
What's cool is that Courtney's collection actually features a replica, and I put replica in air quotes because honestly I think that my 2000s mini Molly looks more accurate than this one. They made Courtney a replica of the original Molly. So it's cool that Courtney gets to like meet her own idol, like they live in my room together. She says, Molly, you're like so cool. Yeah.
There were a lot of exciting things in the 80s, and of course we started with American Girl. Something else about American Girl that's worth noting is that the original dolls were produced in Germany, and so were their clothes and their accessories. And there definitely is this misconception in the doll community that just because they're from the 80s that makes them better. But as someone who's had American Girls like most of my life since the age of 6 onward, the thing about old American Girl stuff is although it was aimed for children to collect and play with, it's definitely not play quality. Even the dolls themselves are a lot more fragile. Their eyelashes are more prone to shedding. Their wigs are sewn super funky. Like Molly has these really long wefts, like short hairs to cover the wefts that stick out of her braids, which is really inconvenient. The way that they're strung, their like limbs pull out of their sockets more, and the white muslin bodies are mega impractical because if like you go to clean one of these dolls and you don't want to wash the body and a little bit of water gets on there, any dust or anything that's inside the stuffing will bleed out onto the white muslin and leave ring marks, and then you have to.
It was really inconvenient.
Yeah, that happened on Molly and Samantha. These dolls are also really prone to getting silver eye, which is when the decal inside flakes. So that is something that when Mattel took over, they fixed that problem. So in like the early 2000s, they started producing better eyes that don't get that problem. And they also were prone to bubble eye, which is like when it looks like there's like a bubble inside the eye. We have
Valerie has it, Isabella has it. Yeah, a couple of them have it. Another thing that I prefer about the later dolls compared to the early dolls is that, especially like you can see it on 80s Sam, like she has a very gray casting to her, and 80s Molly isn't, considering her age, isn't quite as bad as Sam, but even her coloring, it's not nearly as good as like this coloring.
Bring her over. She's off frame.
I'm like, oh, she's out of frame.
Yeah, so, and they also would go yellow a lot too, the Pleasant Company dolls, and they don't have much face paint. Like Samantha's eyebrows are like non-existent, and if they have bangs, that's not really a big deal. But on later characters, like Felicity that came out in the early 90s. She's kind of scary looking because she doesn't have much like facial definition. They tend to get kind of a bloated look with age because they're made from like a squishier plastic as opposed to the harder kind. It wasn't just the dolls. The accessories were impractical. Like Molly's original hula skirt was made from actual crepe paper, which, as you can imagine,
I don't still have it for a reason.
And it would be, I mean, unless you're going to keep it in a box, like you could not use that more than a few times. They had the pets used to be made of, as somebody with small animals who always found that like leather and stuff was nasty, the original pets were made from rabbit fur. So yeah, these Bennett, this is the original Bennett. Colin got a nicer one on eBay some years after
My
we
guy's
started
tail
collecting.
and ears fell off. He's like in a little box in Molly's
And
trunk.
then I have 2 sets of Kirsten's kittens. One I got at the flea market for really cheap, and then the other ones were given to us, but they I wouldn't ever bought anything rabbit fur. It's so disturbing. I mean, an animal fur is not salvaged in any kind of humane way. Side note, kind of disturbing. And then because of how delicate they are constructed underneath, as Colleen said, her childhood Bennett, who she still has, he's just
in pieces,
kind
literally.
of like in a grave almost. He has like a broken tail and ears and stuff. So it was just, a lot of it might look nice, but it's just...
And the fur on one of his
wasn't.
legs is actually separating.
It just wasn't very practical for play, and the target demographic for this was like children to play with their dolls. But we love them anyways. Cabbage Patch dolls. They were like a plague that hit the doll market. If you grew up in the 90s, and you might remember how Beanie Babies took over, well, Cabbage Patch dolls were like I heard stories of like women physically fighting each other in stores for a Cabbage Patch doll. People had to like try to make special orders through Toys R Us. It could take months to get your doll because it was just in such high demand because people thought that they were gonna be like really collectible. And the funny thing is, by like the middle of the decade, they had tapered off. So the idea for these dolls actually stemmed from something that happened, something made in the late 70s. The Little People dolls by Xavier Roberts. They are soft sculptured. Our fella here, Baldwin, he is actually from the 80s, 83. And the idea was stolen from another doll artist, Martha Nelson Thomas, if you don't know. But Xavier Roberts took the idea and popularized it, and then worked with the company Coleco to mass manufacture. This is Dennis Paul.
He's from 85.
The kind of Cabbage Patch doll that was selling out at stores and people were fighting each other over. And you can see they're like very different looking. You could get these in a lot of different sizes.
And you can see that like he's more like a friendly size for a small child, because this is huge compared to a small child. But you can see the facial shapes are similar. And
Cabbage Patch dolls were like a whole thing on their own. They had the Kusas. They made a lot of weird things like this in the 80s. Like they had dolls that were made by some manufacturers like Mattel that were like animals.
Yeah, it's
like
very similar
people.
to Monster High, but like
Yeah, but it was kind of like an older version, which might seem creepier.
And it didn't really seem to have caught on because when we were growing up, they didn't really have stuff
It was
like
ahead
that.
of its time, for sure. I think kids these days would resonate a lot more with like the Kusa. This is my newest one, Clarence. I got him at the flea market. And this is actually an 80s fashion pack. They did sell fashions for Cabbage Patch dolls. A lot of times they were
They fit the Kusas too.
what you could get on the dolls sold as fashion packs, but they did have like these were career rompers.
Okay.
And then they had animal sleepers, which I've collected all of those because I think they're so cute. The preemies. It was like an enormous brand, very popular.
We could be here all day just talking
Books,
about Cabbage.
like I said, they were very popular up until about 85, and then I think it kind of started to taper off. There was also Strawberry Shortcake, one of my favorites. If you've been watching my channel for years, I talked a lot about them in 2016. I don't have the best luck finding them, but, so if you're not familiar, Strawberry Shortcake is actually a thing that's still current today. But like Cabbage Patch dolls, the idea is licensed to different manufacturers. So over the decades, over the years, the company that makes them changes. Whereas Barbie is a like Mattel idea, Cabbage Patch was Xavier Roberts' idea and was licensed out. So Original Appalachian Artworks licenses it out because that's his brand. And then like Strawberry Shortcake is a licensed product, kind of like Disney. Kenner, so that was a division of Hasbro, I believe. They produced them in the 80s and they were really popular. They had like a TV show and all kinds of merchandise. Pretty much all of my 80s ones I got for free. One of my neighbors years ago in 2015 put out like a huge box of a bunch of different things. There's a whole group of them. They made fashion packs, which my original strawberry shortcake was wearing. They had villains, Purple Pie Man and Sour Grapes. They're supposed to be scented, but they don't really smell like anything anymore. A lot of like toys from the 80s, I notice it doesn't really matter what make it is. I noticed that they do get, like the American Girls, it's kind of like gray casting to their skin.
Yeah.
So some of my dolls that you saw might have looked dirty. They're not. That's just
He's a little grayish.
the way that they've
But
discolored.
not as much as Strawberry.
And
so.
these earlier dolls have like pretty low quality hair, and their fashions are pretty. They're like detailed, but they're made of not the greatest fabrics, but they're so cute, and they have a really simple like facial screening style.
And you can see that like the skin, like how it ages over time really varies, because the angel face doll looks really good, and whereas he's very, very
and
gray.
these were all from like the same home.
Yeah.
Disney dolls kind of made their first foray into like the, I guess you could say like the Barbie 1/6 scale for the first time. Now Mattel at this point didn't have the rights to Disney, but there were for certain like anniversaries of movies, one of them being Snow White. But there was also Cinderella dolls made by the same company, the Bicken dolls. I don't know when that company went out of business, but we have the Queen. You can tell these are on my display. We have the Witch.
Prince.
Yep, and then I brought two of my dwarves. I have the whole set. I actually don't have Snow White, funnily enough, but we have Happy and Grumpy. And you can see like how the 12-inch dolls, they don't really look much like the characters. They kind of look like clone dolls, and they're kind of poorly constructed. Like they have weird rubbery feeling arms and strange hand molds. But the dwarves, they're made from like a cheap hollow plastic, but the facial sculpts on these are amazing. Like
Very amazing.
I've seen a lot of different dwarves over the years made by like Mattel or the Disney Store, and these are my favorite. These are what made me fall in love. They had fashion packs for the Bicken dolls, whether it was Snow White or Cinderella. They had like a cottage they made for Snow White in particular, and then for Cinderella they sold like the mice separately. It's very cool. Definitely worth noting. They're weird quality compared to like the 90s, which I would say is like the renaissance of the Disney dolls when they were at their kind of peak in terms of detail and quality. There were other movies that you could get dolls for, because, you know, that's a pretty common theme throughout the decades, especially as this style doll took off in popularity. So I have like a Wizard of Oz doll. They've made a lot of these over the years from different makes, but this guy is from the 80s, and they had like other characters in his sets. And this movie must have been pretty popular at the time, because there were fashion packs even, like little costume sets they called them for your dolls, which one of our Mattel lines from the 90s doesn't have his like outfit, so we have an 80s one that he wears. Yeah, it's really cool because he's actually like not like the Mattel ones. He isn't a regular doll. He's kind of more like an action figure.
Yeah.
Whereas like the Ken dolls, for instance, they're just kind of sewn into their outfit.
He kind of reminds me of something the Disney Store would make in that regard.
Yeah.
He's like fully sculpted. He's not just a Ken doll in an outfit. He's really interesting.
Sadly, I only have him, but I've seen over the years lots of dolls like him from the 80s. Celebrity dolls were still going. They're still going to this day. And you can really see what kinds of celebrities appealed to kids and like the marketing behind the celebrities. So I don't have a lot of celebrity dolls from this era, sadly, but Brooke Shields is one of the notable ones. Again, they only sold like 2 versions of the doll, but they had tons of fashions you could get for her. She comes in this like signature look, and you would get like a poster of her with the doll. And something very common with dolls of this time I've noticed from a lot of different makes is they're very prone to losing their legs, because her legs were off when I got her, and then like Tycho dolls, which Tycho Ariel is more a 90s thing, which is why I'm not talking about her, but there were ones from the late 80s because of when the movie came out, and their legs fall off, and some Barbies from this era, their legs fall off. Ken's legs are always falling off.
Always falling off. So next we have some dolls that are made by Mattel, but we're not quite talking about Barbie just yet.
So these dolls are dated 1979, but they were available more so in the 80s, because that's how box dates usually work. when you're at the cusp of like a decade. So Star, if you are a kid of the 90s, then you would remember Generation Girl. I feel like this is the predecessor to Generation Girl. They were high school aged teenagers. They had fashion packs. They had, I think, a few little play sets. You could see there was like a group of friends, kind of sort of like how nowadays there's Monster High and Rainbow High, but these were meant to be more realistic looking. They have kind of interesting head sculpts.
They kind of remind me of the Generation Girls.
That's what I was saying. They're not for everyone. They're kind of weird looking. And you can see that back in the day, Mattel especially strung their man dolls, so he has elastics running through him.
Case in point about the legs.
And actually, it's a good segue here because these dolls, they didn't really, I don't think they really took because they only made like one line of them and then they kind of disappeared, but they used parts of like the head molds and parts of the body molds to make the line that did get popular, the Heart family. Now, in the 70s, the first kind of version of this was the Sunshine family, which I believe I mentioned in that video, where it's based on like a family with kids and, you know, the mom gets pregnant and they have more kids. That was more like hippie, earthy, like let's grow our own
crunchy
food,
granola.
crunchy granola, really up my alley. Whereas the Hart family, they actually had a loose affiliation to Barbie. She wasn't advertised, which is ultimately what led to the downfall. They were very popular in the mid-80s. They came out in 84, or their box dated 84. So this is Kiss and Cuddle Mom, and this
the original
is her
dad.
And he uses just like the Ken's African American head mold, and she uses the Steffi head mold, like this particular doll. The Caucasian mom uses Kelly's head mold from the Star line. These are really cool. If you grew up in the 2000s, then you would know Happy Family. These were sort of the predecessors to that. Similar thing, but that's why I think in the early 2000s they made a direct tie into Barbie to help sell it. But these dolls were big. I mean, they had a bunch of little friends. I didn't bring out any of my kids, but I have a whole collection video on them if you're interested. They had like babies, they had play sets. I know they had like themed sets like Disney and school. It's very cool.
And then speaking of Jazzy, before we bust her out, I wanted to talk about Maxie, who you can tell, was she by Hasbro?
Yes.
Who clearly was inspired by Jazzy. Like the feet are the same, and like even though she doesn't have that same distinctive like loose, like kind of like the 87 Skipper mold with that like articulated waist, you can see that her like the slimming effect is very similar.
The big feet.
The giant feet,
Crimps.
the thick legs, the crimps. You can tell this doll was very
like
inspired by Jazzy.
A teenager, and she probably was made to compete with Jazzy, who was popular at the time. Jazzy is Barbie's cousin. We'll talk about her next, but Maxie had an entire franchise too, and I don't know how well these dolls sold. I just know as a kid collecting used lots in like the early 2000s, I had different fashions, and I got this doll actually in a lot as an adult. They're definitely kind of weird looking. I'm sure there's probably some debate as whether or not they're like a clone of Jazzy or a competitor. There's always kind of that gray area because Hasbro's like a bigger company, and these dolls are actually nice quality from what I can tell. But yeah, that whole like teenage, we're in high school and we're going to the beach was very popular. Speaking of Jazzy, I have a few Jazzy dolls here now. I actually think that this girl, if I'm not mistaken, is from 1990. But Jazzy was Barbie's cousin that Mattel tried to create into like her own separate brand. And she was high school themed again. She was sort of like Generation Girls of the 90s, or kind of like Monster High of today, where it was very centered around high school. She had like a boyfriend. She had friends like Chelsea. You can see they have their own interesting proportions. She had fashion packs. I believe she had a few play sets.
Yeah.
I unfortunately don't have a lot of these dolls, and neither of them are wearing Jazzy clothes because, I mean, her pants are, but because they're just kind of obsolete. They've always been.
Yeah, they've always been kind of hard to find.
And by the early 90s, Mattel merged them into Barbie's line, so Jazzy would appear as part like of a beach line, kind of like what happened with Shani, who is from the 90s too. Speaking of Jazzy and how she wasn't popular, some of the molds again were used because Ken had a friend from the Barbie and the Rockers line named Derek, and he uses a dude's head mold who is Jazzy's boyfriend here. So that's really interesting how Mattel would recycle things, and he's really hard to tell apart from Dude. I think it's all just about like the highlights in the hair, but otherwise they're the same. Now that we're into Barbie, who we've saved for last. Barbie, since she was around from the 60s, there's a lot to compare her to. There's a lot of changes that happened with Barbie in this decade. This time is the start of the Barbie boom, the late 80s, which bled into the 90s. That's really the time when Barbie was at her peak popularity, peak sales.
Lots of collector's books written.
And that's because people started seeing her as collectible. Prior to that, there were collectors, but it wasn't like this really widespread phenomenon, kind of like how you're seeing now with the release of the Barbie movie, or like with Bratz coming back. People are dabbling into that when they weren't previously into dolls. So that's kind of what happened with Barbie in this era. There were a lot of notable things about Barbies in this time frame. First of all, Barbie herself was actually made as an African American. Prior to this, Barbie did have African American friends like Christy, but Barbie herself was always Caucasian. It was in that time, as you can see I have two here, Great Shape and Day to Night, who I rerouted. They are some of the first versions of Barbie as African American, and the original Barbie was actually marketed as Black Barbie. And as somebody who loves collecting dolls of different skin colors and ethnicities and backgrounds, I certainly would have not been very fulfilled in the 80s because dolls of different ethnicities were just not as common. I feel like it was probably more so like a marketing move on their part to look inclusive, but because it just wasn't selling the same, they didn't put the same energy into it. So for instance, sometimes they would use the same head molds. Like, I believe they're using the same head mold as this twirly curled Hispanic Barbie.
And there were a lot of Hispanic Barbies in the 80s too, because in the tropical tropical line.
These are a lot harder to find for that reason that Mattel wasn't mass producing them on the same scale. Even to this day, a lot of times African American dolls are in their own assortment. They are not produced in the same numbers, which is why at places like KB Toys we used to find predominantly black dolls, because they would be in their own assortment and those would be all the leftovers that would get sent to the discount places. So it's interesting how some of those trends are still very apparent today. So originally Barbie was produced in Japan. She was Japanese made, and then some things were made in America. But as you move into the 70s, that's when Mattel started outsourcing more of their production to cheaper countries of manufacture. The 80s is the most diverse time. There are dolls made in Taiwan, Malaysia, Philippines, Hong Kong, China, Indonesia, Mexico before one of the factories burned down. There were just so many different makes, and with each country make, you would see such variation. I'll include some pictures here of some of the dolls from my collection and how you can see from country make to country make they vary.
So I have many examples of variation in my 80s Barbie album specifically, but this is just a sampling. Some are the same make but look very different, and some are different country makes. It's fascinating.
Sometimes even the eye dots would be different, like the facial paint itself would be different.
One of her Day to Night Barbies has very interesting screening.
They would have sometimes different articulation. Hong Kong dolls, for instance, are known for having very static body molds. They would only turn their heads side to side. They didn't have the pivoting rotation. Two dolls could be the same country make, but could look very different. Mattel also was making less different types of Barbie in the earlier part of the 80s, so that's why it's so much easier to find some of the iconic ones, because kids tended to have the same dolls. Just like when Bratz came out in the early 2000s, us kids would have the same dolls because MGA wasn't putting out as many lines. Same with Mattel. They would have kind of a set number of Barbies they'd produce. But as their popularity grew, then you get to today where there's so many that you couldn't possibly collect them all. Country make variations. This can also lead to certain, factory defects that are common today that you'll see on dolls from this time frame, like leg splotches where they look like they have the measles. I don't believe I have any.
I've seen if any of the ones I took out from my container have it.
Funnily enough.
I have many examples of the quote-unquote measles, but on my Funtime Barbies you can see them plain as day on the two on the ends. It's a little hard to see on my cabbie named Wendy, but you can see a few little faint bleached out looking spots. This is the same thing called, quote, cabbie pox on a Cabbage Patch doll.
It looks like the pox that Cabbage Patch dolls get. They have discolorations. They might be pink, they might be paler, like bleached out looking. It's not mold. Sometimes they'll be like bluish. It's from the two types of rubber separating. And there's nothing you can do except to get a new body or try to paint over it or something.
My
You can
true
actually-
secret, it's so bad you can kind of see it through her tights.
Yeah, and there are other things too, like the faces losing their color. You'll see some dolls. I have a few in my collection actually where they've gone like really yellow and pasty. It was common with just Mattel dolls in general. And you can relate that a lot to problems of today where for like a huge chunk of the 2010s there was a glue seepage problem, and then with Band-Aid dolls from the early 2000s there was hair that would dry rot. MGA had problems with doll hair dry rotting where it just kind of breaks off. Like every decade and every manufacturer has like sort of these factory defects or these common
Like
problems.
Silver Eye you were talking about with the American Girl.
And yeah, and I think that people sometimes forget that, and they'll think that like just because it's older it's better made, but every era of dolls
has some kind of defect.
a lot of the manufacturers buy the same hair or they get the same like base plastic, so it can be universal between a lot of different makes. This was also when Kanekalon hair was introduced for Barbie, which I have a video on hair types if you're not familiar, but it's that fluffy fine stuff like what Jazzy has over here. They actually discontinued this hair a few years ago. It's the manufacturer, it was Kaneka Industries I think, and that's where the name derives from. This is the hair that they made for the smaller scale dolls, and American Girls have Kanekalon hair too, but it's human grade, and they still make that if I'm not mistaken. Prior to that, the hair was you'll see on a lot of my early 80s dolls here, or mid 80s dolls, they have saran hair, or they would have like some kind of nylon, acetate, something like that. This was sort of the introduction of that hair type, which is so, like when you think of 90s Barbie, that's what you think of.
Yeah, you think about big, messy, and it usually got like a grayish tint from age.
There was a definite improvement of quality, I will say, because the 70s, bad quality, as we talked about, because when they first changed manufacturers, specifically for Mattel products, the dolls were they were losing legs, they didn't have a lot of hair, their clothes would be made of they'd be detailed, but they'd be made out of materials that weren't very sturdy, whereas the clothing and the dolls themselves from the 80s, they're very sturdy. I mean, yes, you're gonna get dolls where their necks might crack from age because they've finally gotten brittle, or they've shown signs of play, or they have those factory defects we talked about, but overall, they're just a nicer product, much higher quality. Margot Rana even talked about that in her 80s Barbie book, that was a huge appeal to dolls from that era. There's just a lot of attention put into them.
Yeah, they're beautiful dolls.
Yeah, and I feel like whether you were buying a Playline doll, like really budget like Beach, or you were paying more for a fancier doll like Peaches and Cream, the quality was very equalized, whereas now you can definitely see a difference if you're paying $20 for a Barbie or like those really cheap ones. Not to knock the cheap ones, but you can see a more disparity there, whereas when we were kids in the 90s it was harder to tell.
Oh yeah, definitely.
There were definitely themes that were very common in this era, like pink boxes. This is when Barbie became synonymous with pink. Before that, pink wasn't Barbie's color, which is interesting because if you don't know that and you look at Barbies from the era, you're like, what? But this is the pink Barbie box, the pink collector, where Barbie and pink became one. And it's funny because that's what people always think of when they think of Barbie is pink. That's the first thought, but that actually came later. That wasn't part of Barbie's original styling. And
When I think of 60s Barbies, I see red. Because a lot of my skipper clothes happen to be red.
Yeah, very, and very groovy with the patterns for the 70s. There were a lot of themes that were popular just in pop culture in general that they incorporated. For instance, there were a lot of rock-themed dolls from bands. There was Gem. I don't have any Gem dolls, but she was huge. And Mattel actually made, to compete with them, I believe the story goes that Mattel found out through sources that Hasbro was making Gem dolls, and they really quickly cobbled this line together to have them on shelves first so it looked like Hasbro was the copycat. And that's when they put out the Barbie and the Rockers dolls, and that's one of the most iconic lines of the 80s for Barbie. We have, these are the 85 dolls. They also did a second run of them. We've got Diva and Barbie and
Dee
Dee and Dana, and they were new characters that were introduced. They had fashion packs. That was a very common theme, that when there would be a popular line, whether it was like the astronaut line or dance club, Barbie and the Rockers, Jewel Secrets, they would all have like affiliated fashion pack lines. A lot of fantasy themed dolls, which I feel like that's still pretty relevant, but
Oh, yeah.
they did have a lot of like, and space seemed pretty popular for some reason.
Space got very big in the 80s.
And the overall style of them, as you got into the later part of the 80s, they would get the bigger hair, the more gaudy makeup, the big earrings, a lot of crimps. They'd wear a lot of layers because fitness was really popular in this time, and they'd make lines like Great Shape, who we talked about earlier. This was like a very common, and like layering the fitness clothes was very popular, and a lot of the stuff was just mismatched.
I have Great Shape Skipper here.
Yeah, it was very mismatched because they were combining a lot of neon colors. So that's sort of like a taste of what Barbie was like, and we have some other examples. So Barbie's friends in the 80s I feel were less consistent, whereas I feel like in the 90s and on,
They kind of had a core group.
they had a core group, but in this decade they kind of changed a lot because Midge did come back, but she was dropped at some point and she wasn't really a strong part of the 80s, but they had like Kayla and Devin, and they'd appear at Bopsy for like one line and then they'd go away. Miko appeared for a few lines, so this is one of my Miko dolls. She was kind of like the predecessor to Kira, and Teresa came out in the late 80s, but I don't have a lot of late 80s Teresa dolls to show. Barbie's family was still very, very relevant.
So I brought out some examples of Ken and Skipper to show. I have some of the like classic looking guys with like the molded hair. That like this look was very, very popular.
My favorite Ken head mold. I did change head molds throughout this decade a few times, but this was sort of the most signature look. You can see there also were rooted versions, so Rockers Ken and Jewel Secrets Ken, and they have just kind of this really ugly John Smith-esque type head mold. But like the outfits, holy silver Batman, like.
Right?
I
Like
feel
so much silver.
That this decade, Ken veered far more into being Barbie's accessory.
Oh yeah.
I feel like, yes, some of the things Ken wore in the 70s were like, what? But guys were wearing those things.
Right, and then you're like looking at his tux and you're like, he's just like, you know, very like romance, Barbie's mancessory to go to dinner. At the start of the decade, she looked very much the same as she had in the 60s,
Yeah,
like
petite.
petite,
Closed mouth,
63 head
smile.
mold, closed mouth, very square looking body with a very flat chest. Later you get,
Smiley head mold.
yes, but she still has like the short body, flat chest. She looked, when I first saw this, she looked like a fakey doll to me. This is 86 Jewel Secret Skipper. Still has the smiley head, but this doll has almost like the forerunner of the 87 body, which caught on. This one really didn't.
They only used it a little bit.
A few times, yeah, and you can see it has that twist and turn, like articulation, the karate arms, the bend and snag legs, and you can see she's like a little slimmer and a little taller looking compared to like this. But then
Also worth noting too that I feel like Skipper was included more in some of Barbie's lines.
she was included in a lot of lines, and another
I mean,
thing,
it's not that she wasn't in the 70s,
Yeah.
but she, like, I feel like she was more like Jewel Secrets and Beach lines. It was more common.
she was very popularized at that time, and also like these two molds, I have fashion packs that when I got the advertisements with them, they were modeled on ones from both molds.
Yeah.
Like simultaneously, like these two traded off for a while, but this mold, like I said, it really didn't catch on. However, later, my favorites, they did the 87 like teen Skipper sculpt. This is 88 teen time Skipper, and you can see it's like instead of the karate arms, it has usually these. So with in 1987, they introduced this new, very charming head sculpt. It's like really adorable and whimsical and does a lot for me. And the new body mold to go with it, and its similarities to this one, like it's taller and it's leaner and it's busty instead of totally flat, but not like Barbie busty. Otherwise, it's very similar. They introduced Skipper's friend Courtney in the 80s, and you can tell Courtney must have been like a popular name back in the 80s because my 80s inspired American Girl also is the name Courtney.
And Courtney actually stayed a friend until the early 2000s.
Yeah.
Then for regular Barbie, I feel like there's just so many, and this is my favorite decade. And my favorite Barbie line of all time is actually Cool Times, but I did not grab any dolls from that container because we already had so many out. But I do have a few from like the first kind of half of the 80s that are really iconic. If you grew up in this era, so there's Magic Moves Barbie, and you can see mine still works, her switch is on. She was actually a Christmas gift in 2020 from my relative. She was boxed, she's gorgeous. And we have Tropical Barbie, who was a Christmas gift from the same relative in 2019. And she had that common problem with the legs falling off. I had to fix her. But it was interesting because her legs just fell off. They weren't actually broken. Peaches and Cream, who might be the most iconic from the decade.
Yeah, I have friends who like bring her up.
I feel like that she was even referenced in the Barbie movie from my understanding.
Yeah.
And something really cool about this era is that the dolls were specially named, the outfits were specially named, and that's something that was true of like the 70s and 60s too. Although a lot of the 60s Barbies were just kind of sold as like Barbie and Skipper.
Yeah.
But by this era, they all kind of had some special name, even if they were selling them as like a basic budget doll. It would be like My First Barbie or Fun to Dress. Whereas nowadays, you get a lot of dolls that are just kind of thrown in a generic package with just like a stock number as your way of like knowing who they are, and same with the fashions. So I think it's really cool how much effort they put into the branding as a whole, and that really does help you. Like when you were a kid, you'll remember Peaches and Cream, and as an adult, when you want to go buy Peaches and Cream again, you know how to buy her. We did bring out a few play sets to kind of show from this era. So I have two. If you've been watching my channel since around 2019, then you'll remember these two sets from our very first, like, it was kind of like the prototype of Dysfunctional Dolly Reviews. It's like the same style video, it was just before we came up with that like playlist title. So they're made by Mattel, but they were like distributed by Arco, which is a division of Mattel, a subsidiary. They're like these generic fashion doll bedroom playset. What's interesting is you'll see the same mold be used throughout, and for some like Barbie, actual branded Barbie items, there's very similar sets.
Yeah.
So it can be really confusing in this era because Mattel was also producing generic items. And another one of those is the backyard pool set. These are really cool. You can see that they even came with like branded products, which is kind of indicative that this was affiliated with a bigger company because they would get the rights to use branding, which you don't see as often now. I feel like a lot of time Barbie food these days is kind of just like generic orange juice or soda because they don't go through the like little extra step of getting like the branding.
And that's Pepsi. In the words of Colette, it's my favorite.
And then I have some real Barbie ones. I'm not taking these out because they're pictured on my Flickr and it's just kind of annoying, but I actually do have the boxes for these. So we have the very iconic Barbie and the Rockers line, and this is what I meant about Barbie lines having a lot of branding around them. So there were more than one Barbie Rockers playsets. I happen to have the stage, which I actually got with several of my Rockers dolls, like all of the ones I showed you except the Barbie, at the flea market in 2013, and I think it was only like $10 or $15, and it's got most of the furniture. And what was really common back then is the back would look kind of plain, but it would show you like what the playset did, and it would list out the contents, which is really interesting. You don't really see that quite as much anymore. Usually the front and back are pretty much the same. And then my favorite playset of all time, now I do have this box, but I actually I have two of these sets, but they're too big to fit in here. It's the Soda Shop playset. So this is my favorite Barbie line of all time, and this is my favorite playset of all time. I got this at the flea market for $10. If you can see that. Oh no, there's an $8 price tag. So I don't know what I got it for. I feel like I got it for $10. I got this at an indoor flea market as a kid, and I actually opened it up and played with it. But because it had been sealed for so long, and this was in the early 2000s, so it's like 15 years old probably, all the stickers would flake. But it's really cool. You can see it's advertised with the Cool Times dolls, and they even, on the back here, this is one of the sets where they have full color images. They show you like how you can fill it with like soda, which we actually did. Really disgusting. It's it's like today, a lot of Barbie play sets come with like Play-Doh or something for you to like an activity almost. Really not the most sensible thing.
Drinking soda is my favorite activity,
and
though.
this leaked a lot. I remember it like dripped. And then the last one I have to share, I actually haven't shown this on my channel because I got it when we were on our YouTube break. The box is in really beat up shape, but I do keep the dream pool in it. We got this at the flea market for I think $15 or $20.
Something like that, yeah.
The guy gave us a deal because we bought something else.
It's
It's really beat up. I keep the pool in it just because it's so oddly shaped, and I have a lot of other Barbie pools. And again, this one.
It's like so beat up in the back.
This one has like the hand-drawn images, which is really cool that they don't do that anymore. Everything's kind of like computer graphics now. It's really cool. Mine isn't complete. I don't have like the shower or anything, but I got extras. I got dolls in this. But it's cool because it actually advertises some of like the dolls and fashions from this era. And I brought out some strawberry shortcake play sets from this era as well. We have the carousel, the snail cart, and a lot of the strawberry shortcake ones converted. So this became like a big ice cream bowl for the kid to pretend to eat. And then the cart actually converts into a table. We have the bake shop, which mine is missing all of these stickers, like the kitchen, and all kind of stored compact. We have the gazebo that opened up.
His name is Escargot.
Yes, which was very cute. I love these. This is one of the reasons why I wanted to get into collecting strawberry shortcake back in the day. But they're not really the best quality. They're kind of a flimsier plastic. But the detail, I think, is really quite phenomenal. So the last thing we're going to talk about are fashion packs from this time. I've mentioned them a lot throughout this video. Like most brands that were even reasonably sized had some kind of fashion packs that was very heavily pushed, and I think that was kind of strikingly different than like in today's world where dolls will sometimes come with spare outfits, but there aren't a lot of fashion packs anymore. I think the idea now is to get you to buy more dolls, and that's why they can create a lot of new characters for lines like Monster High or Rainbow High, Shadow High, stuff like that. Whereas back in the day, it was really quite popular for several decades to have less dolls and more clothes. And like Cabbage Patch, Big and Snow White dolls, Jazzy, Heart Family, Celebrity dolls, they all had like their own fashion packs, even if they were made by a smaller company, which I think is really awesome, and I definitely miss that. In regards to Barbie, I noticed that the fabric from this time frame is very distinctive. They tended to use really like smooth, silky materials that often had like rough edges. They weren't hemmed, but because of the type of material it is, it didn't fray. And a lot of the doll clothes had ties as closures and like belts and things to hold it on. But when there were closures in the earlier part of the decade, metal snaps were common throughout all the brands. But then as you get to the end of the decade, Velcro was introduced, and Velcro was sort of like a revolutionary thing to the doll world. I feel like that's pretty much all they use these days on dolls, unless they're collector quality. They were still using plastic snaps. So when they were incorporating snaps as closures, they were plastic as time went on. Velcro more often than not, but the Velcro back then was very thick, and it would, if you didn't shut your Barbie clothes right or your doll clothes right, it would just pick and ruin everything. I know, because that happened to you. Get like clothing balls, because all the Velcro would stick to each other and stick to items of clothes.
Another thing I noticed a lot of in the 80s is they used, like, you can see it on my Jewel Secrets jacket, that material, it's like fake leather. A lot of time it's white or pink, and it peels with age.
Yeah, it dry rots basically, and all the faux leather peels, which is disappointing to say the least. And something about American Girl fashions of that time is nowadays most outfits, unless they're marketed as separates, come with shoes. American Girl outfits in the beginning never came with shoes. You basically used the meat shoes that came with your doll, or there were a few separately sold options that you would buy. I mean, as they got into the 90s, that started to change a little bit, but like for a long time that was how Pleasant Company marketed. So the outfits would be like $20 to $24, but they usually wouldn't have shoes. Likewise, a lot of times the socks were sold separate.
Yeah.
So that was very different about American Girl clothes. But yeah, overall, I feel like there was so much emphasis on fashions, which made collecting dolls fun, because for me, what made dolls more interesting than, say, action figures is that you could dress them, and you had that kind of like ability to play in a more intricate way to fit like your scenario. Yeah, obviously if you know us, you know we hoard doll clothes.
Literally.
So these are some examples of 80s clothes in my collection. There were variations even with the fashion packs, as you can see here, and a lot of the ties and that silky sort of material, which also caught on in the late 70s. You can see this one too. These dresses have metal snaps, and yes, they are the same. They're just a variation. And an example of one of the lines affiliated with dolls, this is from the Barbie and the Rockers collection, one of the separately sold fashion packs. And Skipper and Barbie still had matching fashions sometimes. This is an example of one of Skipper's. And the Twice as Nice collection, which was reversible fashions, was very popular. This is one of Ken's outfits from that time.
So I hope you enjoyed hearing about the 1980s. Obviously there's a ton of stuff that we couldn't include in this video. There's a lot of doll types that I didn't mention because there's so much stuff out there that I might not even know about. But this is just kind of like an overview, what we noticed trending, some of our favorite things. I have pictures of all the stuff I've shown on my Flickr. And stay tuned for our installment of the 1990s, which will be fun because the 90s is like our childhood. So until next time, love your dolls, love yourself, and love your life.